just to make it clear to everybody before we start, in addition to whatever else I've done at the Times over the years, I have been Margaret's sole editor at the Times since she began in 2015. And I think you worked with one or two of my other colleagues on your very early pieces, but ever since you became a contributing writer and started writing regularly, it's basically been you and me. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think only one other person besides you was the one who was editing the series called The End.
Roberta Zeff.
Roberta. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful editor, yeah. So I guess it's significant that, you know, I'm not just a person kind of asking you questions, but that we have been working pretty much every week for the past 6 years or so. And of course, that made me think about our relationship, the editor-writer relationship, and how that evolves. So just to kind of go back to the beginning, I want to ask you, do you remember the first time we worked together, or the first piece, or the first time that we had an editorial exchange where you said to yourself, maybe, this guy knows what he's doing, or this guy doesn't know what he's doing, or I hope this works out. I looked back a little bit in my email. I have my own kind of assessment of that, but I wanted to ask what you remember or saw recently.
Well, you know, you when we were talking about this program, you said, I've been your editor for 5 years. And I said, I'm pretty sure it's been longer than that. So I went looking, look what I found. The very first piece you edited.
Oh, Red in Beak and Claw. What a great title. Was that your title or mine?
It was. Y'all used to let me have my own titles more often. But this was about, I remember I sent that first piece in when the Times was running a bunch of different series, and one was about The End. And I had written an essay about how my mother-in-law's last weeks was recalling to me my mother's last years. But there was another series, and you were the editor for it. It was called Menagerie.
That's right.
And this piece was a piece I thought might work for that series. It was about a territorial house wren who was terrorizing the bluebirds in my yard. And as it turns out, you all had discontinued the series, but you decided to run the essay anyway. And then I remember just kind of waiting, like, okay, I have to wait a little while. I can't just like fire off another essay right away. I can't overstay my welcome. But yeah, for the first little while, they were mainly about birds, I think.
Yeah. So Menagerie, right. Menagerie was a series that we had running at the Times that I edited, and it was about human relationships with animals. At some point in my life, I started to realize how extensively we had embraced animals in our daily lives. You know, I live in New York, so there's a lot of pigeons, and there's a lot of small dogs, and you know, people have cats and all that. But I was really interested in hearing about human relationships with animals, and we had pieces on you know, pigs, even lice. We had a great piece on lice that I really liked, and we had a couple on birds, and so I was very happy to work on that with you. But at the time, I don't think that we realized that this was going to be an ongoing relationship. Generally, when you contribute a single piece to the Times, the policy more or less is that you have to wait a couple of months, because it's a platform that we try to offer to, you know, the widest possible array of people and writers. But not long after that, we were considering bringing on contributing writers. A contributing writer, for those of you who don't know, is basically a very valued contributor to our pages that we would like to have on a regular basis. And you know, one of the reasons that we, aside from how beautifully you wrote the pieces you wrote for us, one of the reasons we were really interested in having you is that we didn't really have great representation in the part of the country that you live in. You know, big papers like the New York Times and the papers on the West Coast and the East Coast are sometimes criticized for being, you know, a little coastal centric. And it was really important to us to have you as a voice from the South. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, that aspect of what you do and how you embrace that role, because number one, you're an individual and a terrific writer on your own, but you know, also in this context, you're a little bit of a voice of your region. So I was wondering how you embraced that role and what you thought about it, and how eager you were to take on that role.
Well, I basically was eager to do whatever y'all would let me do, but I was, you know, I think because, you know, I live in a city. I don't live in a rural part of the state, but I was born in a small town, and I spent much of my youth in the country, in the very deep rural South. So and my husband is from the small town South, and I just feel like maybe I've seen a lot of different aspects of the South, but even so, I wouldn't say I represent it. I would never dare to say such a thing, because the South is really a figment of the media's imagination as much as it is a region, because we still think of the South as a region because of our shameful history, really, because we tried to start another country. But I say we, although it was not my people that did that, but it was, you know, there's just such a multitudinous Souths. There are many, many Souths. The Appalachian South is really different from where I live. It's very, very different from the coast. There's, you know, Upper Appalachia, Lower Appalachia. There's the Texas coast versus the Gulf Coast. I mean, the Alabama coast or the Florida coast. There's so many different kinds. And so I guess if I am interested in that moniker at all, it would be to try to make it clear how many different kinds of people live here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was, I think one of the reasons that we started working together, and we worked together very well, was that I'm a big fan of, you know, literature informed journalism. I guess you would call it literary journalism, or the kind of commentary that takes into account, you know, all those things that we fell in love with when we went to school, literature, history, maybe sociology, psychology, philosophy. So I think that, you know, you brought that immediately to your work, and I responded to that. But I think a lot of people, because the Times is so big and such an influential paper and organization, that it seems like sometimes the people who work there just kind of arrive there fully formed. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you did before you arrived there, that kind of shaped your approach to writing and the initial work that you did for us.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty old, and I've only been doing this, you know, a few years. So I had a lot of different, a lot of different formative influences. I was, you know, I went to graduate school to be a poet, and poets don't make a lot of money as poets. So I spent 10 years as a high school English teacher. And then I went to work for full-time as a freelancer. I figured out that a lot of the things I'd been writing about in poems, you could also write about in prose, and people would pay you to write those things. So I did spend 13 years as a full-time freelancer for national magazines, mainly women's magazines, parenting magazines, health magazines, all different kinds. And then I spent 10 years as an editor well, really 17 years, but I mean, a full-time editor for only 10 years for Humanities Tennessee, which is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And but all along I've been writing. You don't want, this as a writer yourself, you just look for ways to write, even when your job is to edit other people. Mm-hmm. And if you're lucky, you get to edit writers that make you want to be a writer too, that remind you of that.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit into the meat, I guess you'd call it, of what you do for us. And I think probably anybody who's tuning in here has some knowledge of the kind of pieces you write for us. So I mean, I see you on different weeks as a writer who tackles different topics. To me, I love the fact that you're often writing as a naturalist, and other times a sort of a political commentator. And I wonder how you approach those topics. There are probably others that you can interject if I'm leaving out any broad areas, but I wonder how you decide each week how to focus on one or the other, and what kind of process you go through when you're thinking about what to write every week. I usually get a nice neat list from you once a month about what you're going to do, but how do you decide what to write, and are one of those areas a favorite of yours?
Well, I mean, part of how I decide what to write is how you react to that list. I mean, if something leaves you cold, then I trust your experience and your instincts. But it would be nice if, my little tagline that y'all assigned to me was flora, fauna, politics, and culture of the American South. And it would be nice if I could just sort of dip into all of those, not necessarily one right after another, but to spread it out, because I am a generalist. I'm not an expert on anything at all. So it's fun that's the most fun part of this work, is that every week I learn something, almost always something I don't know anything at all about. Mm-hmm. But it's not always possible. Like today, my piece today is about why it's important to support wildlife rescue organizations. And I was timing that to the giving season, people who were writing checks at the end of the year and realizing it's time to make some donations. But I might have to do another animal related piece next week because of some other timing issues. So I don't always get to pick the timing, but I guess I'm looking for something that is interesting and maybe ideally surprising, something people might not know, especially something people might not know about where I live or the people I live among. Because I think we live in a time when everybody makes so many assumptions. Yeah. They just leap to conclusions, and we don't have a very high tolerance for nuance and complexity anymore. And that's one of the things I love working with you about, is that you're very tolerant of complexity, and even you like it. And and sometimes you tell me you got to be clearer here. You can't just hint at this. But I always sense that you're telling me that because you just know how readers react. It's not because that's necessarily your preference as a reader or as a writer yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that's something else I sort of wanted to ask you about, and that is, so I would guess for most of your life, or when you began writing poetry and writing, I guess you would say by your own lights, the type of work you really wanted to do. maybe didn't take into consideration exactly who the audience would be, that you were trying to work on your craft at some point when you were starting out as a writer, I assume. And then you find yourself, how many ever years later, writing for the Times, and you know that every week there's going to be probably hundreds of thousands of people at least looking in on what you're doing. I guess what I'm curious about is how you balance this this natural instinct and knowledge you have to write and construct and to talk about the things that are important to you, but also then to be thinking about the audience, what the audience needs on that given week, or the service aspect of journalism. We're always trying to do the work that we think is the best work, but we also have to think about how it's going to land, how the audience is going to take it, and what benefit it's going to have. So I was wondering how you balance that. If you literally think about that, or you just kind of go on your instinct, or maybe you wait to kind of hear from me about that.
You know, it's funny, I didn't realize that I was adjusting, but evidently I do, because I just got the line edits on my next book that's coming out next year. And there are places where my book editor, Joey McGarvey, writes in the margin, I hear an echo of your Times voice here. Like, that's a distinction in her mind between the book voice and the Times voice. And she's not wrong. I just didn't know I was doing it. So I think with the Times, because the audience is so big, and because they're so interactive, you know, they write comments, they at me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. They respond, and I know how they're going to respond. So I guess over the years, I've sort of learned what sorts of details I can add, or phrasings that will make it less likely to be misunderstood. And so with a more literary kind of writing, you know, readers don't want you to just spell it out. You know, they don't want every step right there. You know, they want a little bit of a leap. Or at least I do as a reader. I don't want somebody hitting me over the head with a 2x4. I want to figure out what I think. And there's not as much room for that with 1,200 words, you know, and you figure, I mean, y'all write it on there now. This is a 5-minute read. Somebody's got you for 5 minutes. What are you going to say in that little bit of time that might affect how they think about something, or how they choose to use their time, or their influence?
Yeah, it's almost like more of a performance, right? It's showtime. You have that 5 minutes, and you have to decide what you want to do for that 5 minutes. Whereas if you're writing a book, by the way, which I have both of them here, Late Migrations, and this is not a plug or anything, but
you're making me feel bad, because my copy of Question Everything is back in the family room.
Oh, that's okay. We'll have a separate event for that. You know, I think still behind a lot of what, you know, we're talking about now, and what you do for the readers, you know, is related to your region. You've mentioned it a few times. So if you could kind of describe in a short, a few sentences, what you think the main misconceptions about people in the South, or maybe people who don't live on the coast, what the general misconceptions are about people who live in the South, people who are politicians in the South, and you know, what your goal is. You talked a little bit about you know, the human complexity, how people could, you know, that we're not all consistent, and that's a good thing to remember when there are a lot of culture war type fights and things like that. So how do you think most people see the South, and what are you trying to do in your work to push against those kind of assumptions?
Well, I think probably the biggest one is that people see how elected officials in the South behave and what they say, and they assume that those I don't want to call them leaders because I don't believe they actually lead, but the people who are in positions of political power in this region, they don't often speak for the people who vote for them. It's a conundrum. Like, why are these, like, it's kind of like everybody was so freaked out and surprised when Kansas voted, the people of Kansas voted not to limit abortion rights in their state. And it was like, whoa, Kansas. But that's not surprising. If you gave people in the red states, just regular rank and file human beings who go into the voting booth, many of them are not highly politically engaged. They aren't following the ins and outs of elections. They don't know, most of them, I would say probably a great many of them, I don't know if it's most, don't know the name of their elected representatives. They don't know them at the state level, they don't know them at the local level, and they don't know them at the national level. But if you give these same people a poll or a choice, you find that there's often a huge disconnect between actual voters and the people they vote for. And that's the thing that it makes no sense, but it's true. And it makes no sense until I think about how I voted. Like after in 2012, I didn't vote for Barack Obama because I liked his drone war. I was appalled by the drone war. And yet I'm sure part of it was just that on the whole, he represented my political views better than anybody else. But it's when I think about that in my own past, I can understand why somebody goes in there and their daddy always voted Republican, their spouse Republican, they don't know any of the people, they see the R, they vote, but and there's a lot to object to about that trend, but that is the way it tends to work on both sides of the political aisle. I think at the times, everybody is so politically engaged, and probably the vast majority of the readers of the Times are so politically engaged that it's hard to imagine that for most people, they're going like, I need daycare. I need to be able to put gas in my car. They don't see the connection between those life issues and what's happening on the political stage. And so, in writing about the people of the South, I find myself over and over again saying, people down here do believe in climate change. They are not stupid. They can see what's happening. But they consistently vote for people who say they don't believe in climate change. And that's a conundrum.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, the political environment, pretty much ever since you started writing for us, has been highly charged. We're all steeped in it. We all have to kind of create a balance between staying aware and staying engaged with what's going on politically, but also trying to identify that point where it might not be completely productive to jump into a political argument that everybody's, having at a certain time. Is there some kind of way that you think about these situations where you say, I can comment on this and it would be productive, or I know this is going on and I care about it, but maybe this week it's better to on it, locally or in your backyard or something. What's that process like for you? Do you ever kind of pull back and just say, I'm gonna remain silent this week on this, so that it doesn't kind of add to, the kind of angst that goes on every week, pretty much in the media?
it's really hard to know what to do about that, because it's very easy to conclude that if the purpose of an opinion section is to move the needle in some way to affect opinion, and you don't see very much evidence that opinions are being changed in response to any argument. I mean, it's very hard to see people changing their minds anymore about anything, much less about politics, which is, as you say, so charged. So, I mean, I guess part of it is that I see that you have plenty of people writing about politics. So you don't need me, as a rule, to weigh in on something that's happening at the national level. But I also see that you don't have that many people who are very interested in what's happening down here. And for years, I've been saying you got to pay attention to what's happening in these state houses. It's because what's happening in these state houses is determining what's happening in Congress, because they're setting the agenda. The Tennessee General Assembly is setting the agenda here. And they're sending people, they're drawing congressional lines so that people now, until last month, there were 2 Democrats in the Tennessee delegation in the House of Representatives. Now there's 1, because Nashville got carved up into 3 different districts, and our blue city got the votes in our city got diluted. So, I think if something is happening in this region that isn't getting a lot of play otherwise, then I might feel like it would make sense to just sort of alert the people that this is going on. And sometimes I recognize that, there are a lot of liberals down here, a lot. Pretty much every city in every red state has at least one blue city or college town. And I hear all the time from those people who are happy to know that they aren't alone, to know that their views are sometimes getting a national audience.
Yeah. So, I definitely, noticed, so I haven't calculated the number of weeks that we worked together, but it's probably close to 300 weeks, right?
It's coming up there, probably.
Something like that. So that's a lot. We know each other pretty well. I do know when I get a piece from you, I do feel like, okay, this is Margaret's really worked up about this, or this is a kind of like a more celebratory piece. Sometimes, in the forum, in the op-ed forum, traditionally, there is, although it's a civil discussion, theoretically, between the writer and the audience, anger does sometimes energize a good op-ed, that some writers can use anger to create an effective argument. But then, of course, like we were talking about before, sometimes there's a point where anger will sort of overtake the larger intention of the piece. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, I know there are some things you get angry about. When you have those topics or you have those weeks, how do you approach those? And do you think that they help your work, or is it something that you have to kind of like rein in order to really kind of polish your pieces to the point that you would like them?
Well, I think you rein me in sometimes. Like I don't know if this is fair. I mean, this is what I count on you to do. If I'm out. Well, first of all, I don't think you think, or I don't think anybody thinks that outrage changes anybody's mind. But sometimes when something is outrageous, you kind of have to say it. I don't think you can rely on that rhetorical device very often, or you'll lose everybody. People just don't like angry people. And but every now and then, you don't want to be this milquetoast kind of person who sees some massive tragedy and just goes, oh, well, that's really not good. I mean, if it just depends on the subject, it just, so I got pretty hot, I think, on that American flag piece I wrote at the 4th of July, because it is infuriating that that there's a whole political movement of people who think they're the patriots, and those of us who question or who who take a different political stance are bad Americans. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, but we have a constitution, and I'm the American here, because I'm the one who's saying this is a plurality. This culture is a plurality. And you don't get to decide for the rest of us what makes an American. And so every now and then, maybe the 4th of July, you're going to get mad when somebody co-ops your flag. But most of the time, I don't think it does very much good to get mad.
Yeah. I know you don't like the whole redistricting thing.
I was pretty mad about that too. That's true.
It's pretty maddening. But on the other side, one of the other topics you deal with a lot is the environment in general. I kind of see it as, there are two aspects to your work on this. And I thought maybe you could talk about one, both of them. One is the micro and one is the macro. And then also this kind of idea of hope rather than anger, and sort of persistence in the face of climate change and mistakes that were made that are maybe irreparable, and maybe not being able to do too much, but still persevering. But on the micro side, I think one of the things that people love about your work, and I really appreciate, is that you literally write from your own backyard. Meaning, I've been one time to your backyard, but I've read pieces by you that describe it in great detail, the ecosystems, I almost see that the like the skink and the birds who like populate and the monarch butterflies who visit every year. You describe them with such appreciation and attention and love that I definitely feel like I know the skink.
I knew you were going to bring up the skink.
The skink has appeared in several pieces, but the wonderful thing I think about it is that you use your immediate environs to then talk about larger things. So I guess I want to know, was this something that you consciously did? Like you thought, there's all this interesting stuff going on here, maybe I can amplify it this way? Or was it just kind of like a natural, this is what you saw outside your window and this is what you concern yourself with every day?
I think it's both. I mean, when I was a poet, that's what I wrote about. I mean, this is a part of growing up in Alabama in the 60s, with no air conditioning. The windows were open, the doors were open. You could hear and smell and feel everything. You could hear the birds singing, you could smell the storm blowing in, you could feel the dust, the grit coming through on dry days. It much more so than even my own children, even growing up in my house. We're so much more separate now. People, they drive in their air-conditioned cars into their air-conditioned garages, and maybe they stop and just roll the window down to pull the mail out of the mailbox. I mean, that's so many people's lives now. And but when you grow up where you're imprinted on the smell of a storm or the sound of bird song, it's much harder to ignore it. And also I'm lucky because I work from home, and I have for 26 years. So I don't have colleagues, unless you count the skink and the bluebirds. And so partly it's just, that natural human impulse to connection that draws me. But also I just find my wild neighbors so fascinating, because you see kinship there. You see, when you're paying attention, you see the way their communities resemble our communities, and their way their families resemble our families. But you also see the ways they don't. And in some ways that's the most interesting. So as far as the micro, but it's also true that I have this strong conviction that people only save what they love. Like they don't have any interest in preserving or studying even something that they are indifferent to. So I don't think it's even very subtle that what I'm trying to do is to make people fall in love with what I love.
Yeah.
In the hopes that that would be the first step toward change.
Yeah. That's very, very well said. I remember us talking about that a while ago. And I think it's really true. And in this environment where we, in opinion commentary, especially in a big paper like that, there's so much emphasis on argument as the main tool of persuasion. And I think, I agree with you that there are limits to the effectiveness of that. And I think that, praise and just really kind of highly attentive observation and writing can be just as persuasive in that sense.
Well, I learned that when I was teaching high school English.
Yeah.
You don't, and Billy Collins, years later, after I was the poet Billy Collins, when he was the poet laureate of the United States, all the poets laureate have a little project, some kind of civic project they engage in to bring poetry to the masses. And his was called Poetry 360. And he made this impassioned plea, but it's exactly what I believed when I was a high school teacher, is that you don't convert anybody by taking something apart in front of them. Like you convert people by loving it in front of them. And I think that that's, in your line of work, but in our culture as a whole, we often forget that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we are, we're a social species. We respond to emotional cues. That's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. I was, one of the things I also appreciate about your work is, I'll often get notes from, family members, and they'll say, oh, that Margaret made me cry this week. Meaning like there was some emotional aspect to what you're writing about. And I think this is going to be my transition to the audience questions, because we have a very erudite audience, and we're going to have those in a minute. But I just want to say that I appreciate that even after all these years that you bring that. I think in the news environment, sometimes we're trained to, you're obviously writing opinions, so you can express yourself. But I think the way that you touch on and cultivate emotion in your pieces, while still being kind of clear and rational, is something that readers really like about you, and it's something that I love as your editor. So thank you for that.
Thanks. But tell your family members I'm not trying to make anybody cry.
I know, but I know you've really written a good piece when I get one of those notes. So you haven't made me cry yet, though. That's not.
I knew I hadn't.
if you send constant revisions of your thesis, maybe I will try, but
Not on purpose, anyway.
okay. Okay, so I'm going to read some questions we got in, and they're for you. I kind of can see what they are. Hopefully I won't stumble. So the first one is, many Northerners often move to southern states such as Florida, North Carolina, and Tennessee in search of a higher standard of living. How does the steady infusion of Northerners impact the culture of the South? What impact does the Southern rhythm of life have on Northerners resettling in the American Southeast? That's a lovely question.
Yeah, it's it's a thing that's been happening for a while. I remember years ago. I mean, I'm a transplant to Nashville. I moved here when I was 25. But I remember years ago seeing a bumper sticker on a car in front of me at a red light that said, "Welcome to Nashville. Now y'all go home." And and then I saw a bumper sticker just the other day that said, "Don't California my Tennessee." And I don't even really know what that means. I don't know if this was on a big F-150 pickup truck, and I don't know if the driver thought that the Californians that were coming to Tennessee were too liberal, or if it was a liberal Nashvilleian who thought the Californians who were coming here because they were trying to live in a state with no income tax were too conservative. It's really hard to say what those things mean. But I guess I think that most of those people who are moving here, they're not moving out into the countryside. They're moving to the cities. So they probably aren't experiencing much that's very different. I mean, it's pretty hard to find a native Nashvilleian nowadays. When you meet people who come from everywhere. And as for how I think, like, it cracks me up that people come to Nashville and they think, oh, it's just so calm here. But people who've been here a long time were like, where'd all these people come from? What's this traffic is crazy. So it just depends on your point of view, I guess. Are we slowing everybody else down? I don't know. I don't see a lot of evidence of that.
No, Nashville's a big city. I was, even coming from New York, I was impressed by the traffic. So
yeah, and you came how long ago? Like 5 years ago. I mean, you were here a long time ago. It's way more traffic now. You didn't get to meet the bridesmaids. Remember? The Nashville is like the bridesmaids central of the country. People come here for whatever they call those things.
Bachelorette parties.
Yes, that.
Yeah, I miss those. So okay. The next question is, in what ways does the historical identity of the agrarian South reinforce the region's structural prejudices? Are there more class-conscious interpretations that confront rather than reinforce?
Okay, that's two questions. So let's start with the first one. I think it's no secret that when, a huge percentage of the population is prevented from owning land, from getting an education, from voting, that the ramifications of that, when it goes on for a couple hundred years, aren't dispersed in a matter of decades. So there's still a massive amount of political inequity and economic inequity in this region. I believe you could probably argue that that's true in all the other regions as well. I don't think that Southerners have a lock on racism, not that I've heard anyway. If you look at where the police killings, for example, of unarmed Black men, they are certainly not only in the South. What was the last question, the second part of that question?
I'm not sure I quite get that. I might, so if you get it right away, we can talk about it. If not, we can move to the next one. Are there more class-conscious interpretations that confront rather than reinforce? I think the question is more, is there
Is there pushback here?
active resistance to that
Yeah.
kind
Oh,
of,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's another one of the misperceptions about the South is when people talk about the South, they always, without even realizing it, reveal their own prejudice because they act as though white Southerners are the only Southerners there are, instead of recognizing that there are, just a massive number of Black Southerners, a massive number of immigrants from all over the world.
yeah,
And they, especially now in the age of social media, they can find one another and create political movements. I mean, you look at what Stacey Abrams has done in Georgia for, expanding the voter registration and the voter rolls in a state that's trying every way they possibly can to keep people from voting. It's pretty amazing. There's a lot of pushback.
yeah. Well, that actually is a great segue to the next question, which is, how is the new Great Migration, the resettlement of the South by Black Americans, impacting the social, economic, and political makeup of the South? Do you believe this is a trend that will continue? I think that maybe we need to gird that question with the question of whether there really is a new
I
great.
don't think there is. I mean, I just don't. I know that that's a big thing that Charles Blow advocates for. He wrote a whole book about it. He moved from New York to Atlanta, and he makes a very persuasive case for saying, let's come back, reclaim your power, let's transform this region. If you think about all those people who left the South during the Great Migration, if they had not left, what a powerful voting bloc they would be right now. It's pretty mind-boggling. But I wrote a piece earlier this year that basically said, you want to change the South, basically stop tweeting about it and move on down here and vote. Change things. That didn't go over so great. A lot of people were going, no way am I moving down there. Like my daughter wouldn't be able to have an abortion if she got pregnant by accident. My kids would go to underfunded public schools, and then the whole list of things that would prevent people from moving down here.
Right. Just fix it. That's what they don't want to go there. They just want you to fix it.
No, they don't even really want to fix it. They're having a really good time yelling at us. So
okay, we have another question here. This is a little bit more into the social and political, broader social and political realm. Do you think that people understand today that their parents and their own Social Security and Medicare are at risk of being truncated by politicians? Is there any more awareness of how people vote against their own self-interests? I feel like that's something you've written about more or less over the years. So,
well, I think it's important to understand the shamelessness with which red state politicians lie to their constituents, and I don't just mean in retail politics, meeting people and shaking their hands and making promises on the stump. I'm talking about campaign ads that are flat out lies about, nobody's going to touch your Social Security, or they lie. And I don't know what we can do. I don't know what we can possibly do when politicians have decided that it's okay to lie to their constituents, and they're reinforced by right-wing media who also lie, who have no problem whatsoever about telling bald-faced lies about what their intentions are, what their plans are for when they're in power. It's one of the most disheartening things about our political moment is that we used to, people would try to I don't know, they would try to avoid subjects that they didn't want to have to talk about. But now they just say what they think people want to hear, and then they do whatever they want to do, or whatever they're really, it's whatever they're the people who are writing checks to fund their campaigns want them to do.
Yeah, someone I talk about this with said, you know, she has a nostalgia for the old America where we were at least ashamed of the things that we were doing wrong. Like that you know, that there were secrets that they were trying to hide, the most egregious you know, activities, but that's sort of like a past.
But if you look at what's happening in the state houses across the red states, and like that so-called fetal heartbeat bill that was, you know, almost word for word identical from one state to the next 2 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, these people, even the people in office, I don't think most of the time even know what they're necessarily doing. They're just being handed a written bill by some funder and saying, here, we want you to, you know, sponsor this bill in the House or sponsor this bill in the state Senate. And they do it. I don't even know if they've read them, but they're identical. What happens in Tennessee happens in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, North Dakota. It's not just the South.
Yeah, yeah. So that there's a sort of a national ideology pushing the specifics of the things that go on in the states.
Oh, sure. It's
Yeah.
the Koch network. Absolutely.
Yeah. We're getting very close to having to finish up. I'm going to squeeze in one more question because I know this is really important to you, and you've dealt with it in so many of your pieces. And it is, you had touched upon climate change earlier in your discussion. How do you think climate change has already changed or will change the South?
Well, many of the people who are most vulnerable to climate change in this country are in the red states. They're in the states where, well, first of all, a huge part of the South is coastal. A huge part of the South is agricultural, where if you don't have water, you don't have a livelihood. So it's very it's immediate to people. One of the things, if you look at a map of the Southeast, I'm not talking about like West Texas, I'm just talking about east of the Mississippi River, south of the Mason-Dixon line. You just look at how many creeks and rivers there are here. Just about anywhere you live in this region, you are vulnerable to flooding. And of course, if you live on the coast, you're vulnerable to hurricanes and flooding. It's, I think there's no question that people understand what's happening. That's something that it's changing. We haven't gotten to the point yet where people are holding their elected officials accountable for that. But I think we're close. I think we're really, really close to having people say, you know what, we need you to do something about this. And whether they call it climate change or they call it, you know, unpredictable weather, on our side, on the liberal side, we want them to call it climate change, but that's a politically loaded term. I'd be totally fine if they started changing their ways on the basis of weather. It's okay with me if that's what makes them do it. If it makes them not just prepare communities for the worst, but to, even more importantly, you know, change the way they do business. Like here in TVA is it's the Tennessee Valley Authority that manages and provides electricity to most of the South. They're still all in on coal, or they'll say they want to convert a coal-fired power plant to natural gas. They're not working toward renewables. They're not, and somebody needs to make them, you know.
Yeah. Well, we've reached that that point in the evening where we have to say goodbye. So I want to say thank you, Margaret. We talk a lot, but this was much more fun to see you, and also not ask you about what you were going to write the next week. So thank you for that. I want to thank everybody in the audience, the thousands of people who joined us, and also special thanks to Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel and the Diamonstein-Spielvogel Foundation and the New York Historical Society for putting this together and presenting it. So with that, we'll say goodnight.